Are we set? Are we going? 1, 2, 3.
Yes, excellent.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Chalkboard History. It is hot in Tennessee. Holy cow. Now, I am lucky because I generally wear the same kind of clothing all year long, so I don't suffer nearly as much as some people, but whew, I think it's supposed to be like 97 degrees tomorrow. So
Lord have mercy.
even for me, that's a little warm, but
It's toasty.
yeah, what are you going to do? It's summertime. So today we are going to talk, we're filming 2 episodes, so you're seeing number 1. We're going to talk about the Confederate cemetery at Carnton, and then segue into another topic. So let's talk about the McGavock Confederate Cemetery. What do you remember the first time you ever saw the cemetery? You lived in Franklin long before I ever set foot around
Yeah, I
here.
lived there a long time. The first time I visited Carnton, I visited with the itty bitty kids, and so I was kind of seeing Carnton in the mom of itty bitty kids way, and so I don't remember a whole lot about the first time I walked through the cemetery, if I'm being completely honest.
I do. I remember it like it was yesterday.
Okay, do tell.
I just remember seeing it. I remember pulling up because back in those days you access Carnton through Carnton Lane, and I pulled up on that would be the west end of the cemetery, and I'd never seen anything like it. To this day, there is no other cemetery like it. Now at that time there was also the Franklin Country Club and Golf Course next door, so there was a lot of frolicking around in the pool. People playing tennis, whacking golf balls, and I just remember thinking, what the heck? And
it's a little bit like being in Rome. You have the Colosseum, and then you have a freeway right beside it, and the collision of those two things, they don't fit, and that was certainly what was going on there.
Well, now there's no country club and golf course. It's now Battlefield Park, which is really nice. But I maintain that it is. We'll talk about it's one of the largest private Confederate cemeteries ever. Size isn't always the greatest measure of everything, but it is impressive. And it's solemn and
it's vast. I mean, it's so huge when you stand at the end, and and there is the peace, I think, that you experience now there that certainly was absent when all the frolicking was going on, but I think that strikes people when I take guests out there on extended tours, especially tours where we end in the cemetery. You almost feel that intake of breath because you approach, if we're approaching it from the house, you really can't see the Confederate cemetery till you get inside the McGavock cemetery, because it sits at the top and then the cemetery bends down from that. And so when you turn and you begin to walk, and all of a sudden you can see that long row of orderly graves, it's a bit breathtaking.
Yeah, and coming in from the west end and looking kind of over it or down it toward the house is also really it is quite a picture, and it everything around it changes. It looks different in the summer than it does in the fall, and then of course if there's ever snow, it adds a different level. But it is the story of the cemetery that I think is the most telling, because there's a lot of interesting stuff to look at, houses and landscapes, and but a cemetery like that is so different. And I mean, I've been looking at it now for 30 years, and I'm sure others have looked at it for longer. I mean, gosh, the McGavocks looked at it for half of their lives. So it's established in 1866. As the years have gone on, and as someone who wrote a book about the cemetery, which is really about how the bodies got from where they were first buried to being buried at Carnton, I am more and more struck by its creation, and its creation at this moment in time that only existed for a short while, because the country is going through the magnitude of dealing with the dead, which Drew Gilpin Faust points out well in her book, This Republic of Suffering, and the way that, and I tell this on tour, and it's lessened through the years, but I remember, way back when, I don't think most people ever knew that there was a difference between private Confederate cemeteries and national cemeteries. And there was a reason, and it's a struggle that it's something we still struggle with today. That the reason the Confederates, I mean, there's a few here and there who are in national cemeteries, like Arlington,
Right.
but the Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond and there's one in Marietta, Georgia. I mean, the Confederate cemeteries all over, and there's also Confederate soldiers buried in private cemeteries all over. That's not what we're talking about.
Yeah.
These soldiers were, and hold on now, grab your seat tight if you're sitting down.
Uh-oh.
They were considered traitors. They were considered to be not worthy of being buried in national cemeteries by the government they had fought against. And I know for some people they're like, but that's true. And when I realized, when it hit me, that when you walk through that cemetery, you're also dealing with that intersection, okay? And that you can't get around that.
Right.
You just can't get around that. However, it does provide a different kind of magnitude of what the McGavocks did through a donation of an acre of land. And then the exhumation team that had to dig up the bodies.
Which must have been god-awful work.
Yeah, it's hot. So they're done by now, but they were working in like June.
Yeah.
Digging up bodies that have been in the ground for 18 months.
Well, and even, 2 weeks after the battle, so, immediately they're initially buried pretty much right where they fell, lined right up along the earthworks, along the road there, and a couple of weeks later, after the Battle of Nashville, both of those armies come back through there, and one of the soldiers passing through there, and this is December, said the stench was terrible. You could already see arms and legs protruding. I mean, it's like that in December, and there's going to be a whole year that goes by, and the townspeople living among that every time you go to town, to go to church or go pick up supplies. And the Carters, all they have to do is walk out their door, and it's right there. Every time you go to milk the cows or whatever, that's their reality.
Every time the McGavocks go to town.
Yeah.
Because their dead bodies buried all along Lewisburg Pike.
Right. So they're living with that, but it only gets worse. And by the time the Cuppets get there to start digging up those bodies, I can only imagine.
I was just thinking, I remember years ago how Marcellus Cuppet, the middle brother, so there's 3 Cuppet brothers and a 4th guy that are really doing the sort of grunt work, digging up the bodies. And Marcellus Cuppet, who died in late April 1866 and is buried at the head of the Texas section, was identified until the early 2000s as a former slave.
Yeah.
And I was just like, and I didn't know. I thought he was too, because that's what people said. And it was Rick Warwick, the county historian, who found the Cuppets in a census record, and they were clearly white. And once again, history kind of hits you in the face, and you're like, whoa, wait a second. Why was he identified? Why were people saying he was a former slave? Oh, because white people wouldn't do that work?
Yeah,
only the black guys could dig up the dead bodies, right? Well, it turns out that's not the case at all. And so it's George Cuppet, it's Marcellus Cuppet, it's Polk Cuppet.
Robert Sloan.
And Robert Sloan. And then there's a guy in town, the Baugh family, the father, I think the son's working with him. They're making oak boxes, and they're burying, they're burying bones and some tissue and clothing. It's just really disgusting. But they do this. They finish in June. They exhume 1,481 bodies, and it's incredible what the Cuppets did. And I remember when I was working on my second book. And there was all this. It was Widow of the South mania, and it was of course Carrie's book and all that sort of stuff. And I'd heard
Carrie dug all the graves with a spoon.
Carrie dug all the bodies and took care of them. And
yeah.
People have asked me many times, what percentage of Widow of the South is accurate? You can't answer that question. Yeah. You can't say, well, it was 72.1%. It's just the core of the story.
Yeah, the atmosphere, accurate. All that.
What the McGavocks did. And that McGavock's being John and Carrie. But what they did, the core of the story is accurate. The rest of it, as Hicks himself used to say, was fiction. But what's not fiction is what really transpired and how they how they moved these bodies and how they identified them. And by the way, when they were first buried, they were buried by their buddies. So, there were some crude grave markers and whatnot, and the Cuppets were moving the bodies. Marcellus got sick and died. And it's just to think about working probably 6 days a week, digging up bodies and moving them and burying them in state sections, which was intentional.
And a lot of times right as they had found them. So
Yeah.
in the same
Yeah.
order they find them, they're
Oh my gosh! And
replicating
so years later, I skipped ahead of the story I was going to say about the cemetery book. So let me go back to that, because then we have to talk about the newspaper article that Christy found.
Yeah.
So it was Carrie's book and all that. Well, I knew what John and Carrie McGavock's handwriting looked like, and it's not very pretty. It's really it's very jagged and edgy, and I thought, well, whose handwriting is this? So logically, I was like, well, I wonder if it's George Cuppet's. John McGavock described him as the superintendent of the exhumation team. And I was like, well, that makes sense. But I was like, I didn't even know if Cuppet was literate.
Yeah.
Turns out, I bring Rick Warwick back into it because one day he called me and he said he'd found a letter that George had written to another brother about Marcellus dying. And he said, you got to come see this letter. And I literally ran to my vehicle, drove downtown. And the moment that I saw the letter, I knew that he was the man who'd logged all the names and the units in the cemetery book, which is on display at Carnton, little leather-bound journal, because he had these funny ways of writing his capital letters. His F's and his G's and his H's had this little swirly loop-de-loop, as I've described.
It's beautiful.
Right. He really had beautiful handwriting. And I was like, oh my God, it really is George Cuppet.
Yeah.
Literally, then as things go, 2 weeks later, I find a Nashville newspaper article that has a listing of all the dead, and it said the list of the dead was copied from a book composed by G.W. Cuppet and given to the McGavock.
There you
so I was
go.
like, well, good Lord, I wish I could have found this 4 months earlier, but I was able to piece that together. And then, so I wrote that book. It's been 2007, and then it was probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, just before COVID or just after, that Christy found this newspaper article out of a Missouri paper. And this dude had been in Franklin in the fall of 65. So this is between the battle and when they're moved.
Right.
He logged all of the graves that I think he logged the Missourians. So
Yes,
he didn't
because
log,
that's where he was
right,
from.
because that's where he was from. And when you look at the list, you can see some of the guys who were buried side by side on the battlefield were buried side by side in the cemetery, which was proof to me that what the Cuppets were doing was moving, I speculate, probably 3 or 4 or 5 bodies at a time.
Which you could get
Log them,
in a
load them up,
wagon.
move them, dig a hole, bury them, go back, do it again. Do it again. Do it again. And the meticulousness of what they did.
It shows a respect, a reverence. I think they saw the work they were doing as important and valuable. They cared about it. This was not just a job.
Yeah. Well, and Cuppet himself was a soldier.
Yeah.
George Cuppet. And he lost his brother. We found out years later that Polk Cuppet named his son Winder, which is amazing because Winder would have been, at that time, about 9 years old. So Polk, who was the youngest of the Cuppet brothers, would have known Winder. In fact, John McGavock corresponded with Polk Cuppet because he later lived in Colorado. That's where he's buried. George Cuppet is buried in Franklin at Rest Haven Cemetery. From a whole assortment of people that are famous. He died on December 31st, 1899. He missed the new century by 1 day.
Oh, man.
He was there when they unveiled the monument in the square, which was a month before. So it was quite a process. But then you go back to how it was created. And in recent years, and again, here's another subject where people are like, oh, why do we have to do this? Why can't we just leave history as it was. Well, it wasn't just like, it wasn't all touchy-feely in 1866.
Right.
And it wasn't in, 1966. I think there have always been people that would never think about going to the Confederate cemetery, or who would look at it with some reverence like even I do, and would go, ugh, why would I go there? And that's and that's the truth too. Not everything means the same to everyone. But it was a guest that asked me some number of years ago. And it was one of those questions where you don't really know how to answer it. And the question was, what did they die for? And I really never forgot it, because at that time we were going already in the midst of this reckoning about, and the flag had been reckoned with for years, but Confederate monuments. And I know immediately you say that, and some people are like, it's erasing history. We don't have to talk about that. Well, not talking about it is exactly how we get into these problems.
Right.
Is we just pretend like it's going to go away. And I didn't have a good answer, and I still don't. But I have come to believe, and I've walked through that cemetery many times, and here's how sick I am. Like, I know hundreds of their stories.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I could probably give you some information on almost all 900 or so of the men who were buried there. That's an illness. Mm-hmm. Like, there's something wrong with me. But as I walk through there, I can't help but be struck that they had to die. That's what they died for. They had to die because this country had to fight this war. Mm-hmm. And about the same percentage of them owned slaves as white people did in the South. Mm-hmm. All of the fancy family markers that were put in later on, almost every one of those comes from a former slaveholding family. Yeah, because they had money.
They're the ones who could afford to do it.
They're the ones who could afford to do it. So when you see the poor dudes who don't have one of those, and they just have the regular, now it's either granite or original limestone marker, those are the poor whites. Mm-hmm. You can see the divisions in the 21st century.
Even in the cemetery.
But they had to die. They had to die.
Yeah, I agree. And when I give a slavery tour, I end the slavery tour in the Confederate cemetery, which seems ironic, but it's for exactly that reason, because when we stand at the head of that cemetery and you can see that long line of graves, then I say to them, this is what it cost to finally be right.
Right.
On slavery.
It is the cost, because when you go to a private cemetery like the McGavock Confederate Cemetery at Carnton, and I say that with intent, because that cemetery, although it's owned today by a trustees group, it was and is part of Carnton. Yeah. But a private cemetery, if you go from there to Murfreesboro or to Nashville, to a national cemetery, you're seeing the bookends of this war and of that society and that cultural perspective and the grappling that we had to go through and the death and the destruction to get to the other side. And then there was the McGavocks. John died in 1893. Carrie died in 1905, and they are buried with his parents.
The three
of their children
when they were little, yeah.
And they're buried within sight of all of these men. I mean, they are, and actually Hicks is buried there. Mm-hmm. Hicks is in the family cemetery. So, he was on the board for years. He wrote about it. I mean, he was part of it too. He's part of the story. He was part of the story. He is part of the story. Mm-hmm. It's quite a place. If you've never been, you should come and see it, because there's nothing else like it. Mm-hmm. And I think the story behind it is extraordinarily unique. I don't know of two people in the United States of America that did what John and Carrie McGavock did.
And it wasn't just giving of the land. It was all those years after, as those soldiers came back and their families came back. And there's a story not too long after John dies, 50 Missouri veterans come back to visit. Carrie feeds them, and they
1894.
Talk. Yeah, and they have a conversation with her. And one of them stands up and says, there's a lot of mamas back in Missouri who pray for your health, because they know that you're looking after their boy. You're doing something for him that they can't do. And she kind of stood in that stead for a lot of people, I think.
Yeah. And that becomes, we all get older, and they are doing that work until they are into their 70s. And that is, I don't know if it's God's work or whatever it is, but they did it. And then it was Winder McGavock's widow who actually split the cemetery from the house, because I think she knew that in the future something might happen to the house.
Right.
And she sold it. But the cemetery was always to be treated separately and protected into perpetuity, which it is, and as it should be. So if you haven't been in a while, come and see it. And it's a place to remember individuals, but it's also a place, I think, like any military cemetery, to really ponder what was happening during the war in which they died. Any last thoughts?
I think that's it.
All right, thanks, everybody.